So I have some recent commenters that are asking, why am I challenging and critiquing the left stronger than I am the right? There's a very specific reason I do that, and it's probably not what you're thinking. So let's talk about it. So I'm going to give you a really high-level view of what has happened in the 20th century in the United States in terms of ideology, how we receive information, media, etc. So I want you to think of it this way. Think of the 1960s as a really defining turning point in our history. From, say, about the early 1900s to the 1960s, there was one prevailing ideology. And from the 1960s to now, there's been another prevailing ideology. Now, the early 1900s to the 1960s, conservative norms were the default baseline. So for most of the early 20th century, conservative cultural assumptions defined what felt normal, apolitical, and respectable in American life. That baseline included traditional family structures, Christianity as a cultural backdrop, deference to authority, government, clear gender roles. So that isn't to say that there weren't any progressive influences. Even here, as Chap points out, economically, the state expanded, but culturally, the center of gravity stayed conservative. Now jump from the 1960s to present, and you have progressive ideas increasingly define what is considered neutral. Again, what is the baseline? Starting in the 1960s, that's a gradual but profound inversion. What changed wasn't just laws, it was moral framing. So post-1960s, neutrality increasingly meant skepticism of traditional authority, emphasis on individual identity and self-expression, moral suspicion of nationalism, and so on. Now here, take a look at this. By the late 20th century, many progressive assumptions no longer had to argue for themselves. They had become the default moral language in media, universities, corporate culture, entertainment, NGOs, and advertising. So the question becomes, how did that change and why? This is really important. Well, essentially what happened was late-stage conservative dominance essentially started to abuse their power. By the mid-20th century, conservative cultural authority wasn't just setting norms, it was enforcing them coercively. So then you had things like the Hays Code in Hollywood, which was around the 1940s. Then you had the criminalization and policing of homosexuality. Then you had conformity culture, blacklist, and McCarthyism. All of these things were examples of overreach. And at this point is when conservative dominance started to become more restrictive, and as a nation, we needed balance. Then comes progressivism. Okay, now why does any of this even matter? Well, I would argue that it matters because most of these institutions that have now flipped and are mostly progressively since the 1960s, are all largely in charge of giving us information. So if we are to learn anything from history, we know that at some point, the dominant ideology actually tends to overreach, maybe abuse its power, maybe become restrictive. So right now, post-2016, we might be temporarily living under a conservative or somewhat more conservative framework. But we're actually still very much living within a broader progressive framework. In media, entertainment, and platforms, who dominates? Progressive ideology generally dominates mainstream cultural production. Hollywood, TV, most major legacy newsrooms. In other words, progressives are the mainstream and conservatives are the fringe. Number 2, universities and expert institutions. Who dominates? Progressive ideology dominates higher education, culture, and many credentialed expert institutions. So just to demonstrate that a little bit further, academia in the U.S. is heavily skewed towards Democrats, with recent studies showing a ratio of roughly 8.5 registered Democrats for every 1 registered Republican among faculty, or approximately 48% Democrat to 6% Republican. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of that. The reason that I tend to challenge or critique the left more is, 1, my bias, sure, But another is that because they have significantly more influence over our minds. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that conservative power can't overreach, but I am saying that it doesn't have the infrastructure that progressivism has right now at this moment in history. The truth is, both sides use propaganda, both sides lie, and both sides use things that are happening in our country as part of political strategy. But I happen to believe that the greater impact comes from progressivism at the moment. That shift in power could happen, but it would take a lot longer than 10 years. Well, if you made it to the end of this, thank you for sticking around. I'd love to know what you think about this, by the way. Drop that in the comment and let me know. If you got some value out of this video, can you do me a favor and hit like and subscribe if you haven't already? And otherwise, stick around because there's going to be a lot more coming up.